Stats SA Deputy Director General responsible for economic statistics, Joe de Beer, joins me now. Very good afternoon to you. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. So before we get into the figures, please explain how you've changed how you measure GDP at Stats SA. Very good afternoon to you, Joe. I'm just checking that you can hear me, one, and if you can just explain to us how Stats SA has changed, how we look at what the South African economy looks like.
Good afternoon. Yes, I can hear you quite clearly.
Right.
A few weeks ago, Stats SA published the results of a couple of years' worth of work that benchmarked the economy. And with that approach, what we do is to incorporate data sets that are not available every time we do a quarterly estimate of the GDP. We think of releases or reports that only come about every 3 years or 5 years. So periodically we'll use the opportunity to incorporate these data sets and also to refine the methods that we use. One of the more striking method changes that we made was to separate education and health out of the government sector, as we used to call it, and include it into the personal services sector. So now if we look at the composition of the economy, the size of what was called government has now gone down quite significantly, and personal services has increased correspondingly. And that is a more accurate way to dissect the economy, because health and personal and education is much more of a personal service that we consume as households than what it is something that is done by government.
Mm-hmm. When you look at these changes in the data set, then what's the result of what the South African economy actually looks like?
The size of the economy in today's values increased by roughly 10%, depending on the year, which moved us from a 5 trillion rand economy to a 5.5 trillion rand economy.
Mm-hmm. And so before we get into the current statistics, I know that there's always been a tussle on the continent about which is the biggest economy. Nigeria and South Africa always vying. With that increase of over 10%, what does it look like in terms of where we rank on the continent in terms of size of our economy?
Now we're still firmly in third place behind Nigeria and Egypt.
All right. So let's get into the current statistics that were released. South African economy recording growth of 1.2%. And despite those 4 consecutive quarters of growth, it's still smaller than pre-pandemic levels.
It is. The actual size of the economy for the second quarter of 2021 is roughly the same as the fourth quarter of 2017. Since 2017, the economy did increase. But just before the pandemic hit, we were on 1.147 billion. So it's about 10-15 billion rand less. Very comparable, but we're not yet there.
All right. Can you just give us insight into what drove growth in the second quarter?
So the growth for the second quarter is estimated at 1.2%. And a couple of the driving forces there would first be transport and communication. Communication, one would expect, as a lot of people still work from home, there's much more usage of data and telephone services. Land transport did quite well because mining put in a good performance. And as we mine the different minerals, we need to transport them to the harbors to get it exported. Agriculture did very well again. It increased by more than 6%. Personal services increased by 2.5%, but made a contribution of nearly 0.5 percentage point. And we can trace that back to an increase in expenditure on health services. During the second quarter, there was an uptick in membership of medical aids. And you will also know that there was a big drive for COVID vaccinations during this 3-month period.
All right, Joe, let's talk about COVID-19 and the impact that it had on growth and certain sectors connected to COVID-19, spurring economic growth in South Africa.
It is difficult to have a single answer to what the impact of COVID is, because many industries are affected differently. On the one hand, you would have the hospitality industry that would be very heavily impacted. If we have strict lockdown regulations, then we know the impact on hotels, vacations, restaurants, alcoholic beverages. But that does not necessarily have the same impact on the construction sector, for example, if the people are still able to go to work. So on balance, it is quite tricky. generally, as long as there are restrictions, the economic growth will be a bit more muted than when there are no restrictions. But the counter is also true that we need to be cognizant of the COVID levels of our trading partners, as an example. If you find countries that import a lot of goods from South Africa and they are under COVID regulations where they, for example, close their borders and they don't import from us anymore, then we can't export and produce these things. And the mirror side is true again. If we are dependent on the imports of machinery and equipment from our trading partners, but they close their borders, then we get stuck with the decrease in the economic growth. The world is so integrated at the moment that it's very difficult just to view it in isolation.
All right. I know that you are not a soothsayer. You can't really see into our future, but we know that we've had 4 consecutive quarters of growth. The time that's been measured is before the unrest in South Africa. So the expectation is that we may not see growth because of the impact that had on the economy.
Very true. The data that we will be publishing for the month of July will be of very great interest to the commentators and to ourselves. And we will start seeing those results even later this week into the rest of the month. We will be able to start getting a firmer grip on what happened with manufacturing, with trades for the country. Even though some of the events that took place in July was isolated in Gauteng or in the KZN province, it might still have been a big enough disruption to pull the national levels down. And that will give us a better feel for what to expect for the third quarter estimates.
Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. As Stats SA Deputy Director General responsible for economic statistics, Joe De Beer, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.